The fifth cement truck thundered across the bridge like a declaration of war. Its massive wheels crushed century-old oak, splintering the air with groans that echoed through the valley. And in the reflection of my kitchen window, I could see her, Deborah Kensington Price, the queen of the HOA, sipping her morning coffee with that thin, polished smile that made my blood boil. She thought she had won. She thought her trucks would destroy what 4 generations of Thornfields had built with their bare hands. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't some helpless old man watching my legacy fall apart. I was a retired Army Corps engineer, and she had just made her first mistake, underestimating the man who designed war bridges for a living. That morning, the diesel fumes wrapped around the house like poison. My grandmother's china rattled in the cabinet. The air trembled as the wooden beams cried under the truck's weight. But while most men would have shouted or begged for mercy, I simply watched. I wasn't trembling from rage anymore. I was calculating. Every sound, every crack, every fracture told me a story, and by the time the last cement truck crossed, I already knew what I was going to do. They thought they could break the bridge. What they didn't know was that they had just built the foundation for their own downfall. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Marcus Thornfield, 52 years old, retired from the Army Corps after decades of designing flood control systems, field bases, and reinforced bridges in the worst war zones you could imagine. I came home to the land my great-grandfather bought nearly a century ago, 40 acres of creekfront farmland, with a bridge that wasn't just wood and bolts, but family history carved into every grain. The bridge crossed Willow Creek and connected our home to the main road. My great-grandfather cut that timber himself, hand-shaped every beam, sealed it with linseed oil that still gave off that faint, sweet smell after all these years. 4 generations had crossed that bridge. My grandfather proposed to my grandmother on it. My father taught me how to fish leaning over its rail, and I carried my wife across it on our wedding day. Even now, I could close my eyes and hear the soft burble of water below, smell the honeysuckle that grew wild along the banks, and feel the cool wood that had weathered both storms and time. That bridge wasn't just part of the land. It was the spine of our family's story, until Deborah Price showed up. She arrived like a storm dressed in silk, perfect blonde hair, polished nails, a lawyer's voice that could slice through marble, and a hunger for control that matched any general I'd ever met. At 48, Deborah was what you get when corporate greed finds a suburban throne, a woman who traded courtroom battles for neighborhood tyranny. Within months of moving into the new Willowbrook subdivision, she'd charmed, bullied, and manipulated her way into becoming HOA president. Her first order of business? Declaring my century-old bridge a community safety hazard. I still remember that day. She came to my porch in a spotless white blazer, holding a folder like it contained divine law. "Mr. Thornfield," she said sweetly, "we're concerned your bridge doesn't meet modern safety standards. The HOA recommends replacement with an approved concrete design." I smiled. "Ma'am, this bridge stood before your subdivision even existed. It's safer than any of those prefab walkways you people installed." Her eyes hardened, lips curling just enough to show she wasn't used to being told no. "Then you'll face daily fines until it's replaced," she said, handing me papers worth less than the ink they were printed with. I watched her walk away, every step calculated, every word rehearsed. That's when I realized she wasn't just trying to modernize the bridge. She wanted the land it stood on. It didn't take long for her plan to unfold. 2 weeks later, massive cement trucks started using my bridge as their approved route. Every driver gave me the same rehearsed shrug. "Sorry, HOA orders." These weren't delivery trucks. They were wrecking balls with wheels. Each one weighed 30 tons, shaking the ground until my windows rattled. I'd watch the oak beams flex and creak like they were crying under pressure. And all the while, the sweet smell of creek water turned to the bitter stench of diesel and dust. 3 weeks into this silent siege, her brother-in-law, who conveniently worked as the city's building inspector, showed up for a random evaluation. He took one glance at the bridge, tapped his clipboard, and declared it unsafe. 30 days to demolish or we'll do it for you," he said, smirking like a man reading a script. I didn't even bother arguing. I just nodded, pretending to accept defeat. Because I'd learned long ago, the best soldiers don't fight when angry. They wait, observe, and strike only when the enemy is blind. That night I sat on the bridge in silence. The moonlight reflected off the creek like silver ribbons. The air smelled of honeysuckle and decay. I could almost hear my great-grandfather's voice, calm, stubborn, unyielding. That bridge had stood through floods, storms, and time itself. But now it was facing something worse. Greed disguised as progress. As I traced the grooves of the wood, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about saving a bridge anymore. It was about defending a legacy. A few days later, my daughter announced her engagement. She wanted the reception in our backyard, the same spot where her grandparents had celebrated their golden anniversary. For the first time in months, the house filled with laughter again. But happiness and evil rarely share space for long. On the day of the wedding, when guests were arriving, and my daughter stood glowing in her grandmother's lace gown, the first diesel roar echoed down the road. One truck, then another, then 6 in total. They came thundering over the bridge like an invading army. The wood screamed under the weight. Guests froze, children cried. My mother clutched her walker mid-crossing, terrified. The bridge swayed, the air filled with the smell of burning diesel, and when I looked toward Deborah's house, there she was, watching from her kitchen window, coffee cup raised like a toast. That's when it hit me. This wasn't coincidence. It was war. And Deborah Price had just fired the first shot. That night after the wedding, silence sat heavy over the house. The guests had gone, the laughter replaced by the echo of diesel engines fading into memory. My daughter's perfect day had been stolen by the growl of cement trucks and the trembling of my great-grandfather's bridge. I stood at my study window, staring at the dark silhouette of that wooden masterpiece, cracked but not broken, and I promised myself something. I wasn't going to rebuild in defeat. I was going to fight back. And when I was done, Deborah Kensington Price would wish she'd never crossed that bridge. Literally, I started by following the money. It's something they teach you in the military. Every operation, no matter how well disguised, leaves a paper trail. When I overheard 2 drivers joking about Kensington Construction paying double overtime for weekend runs, the puzzle began to take shape. Deborah's maiden name was Kensington. Her family's construction company had supplied every cement truck crushing my bridge. That meant every run, every pound of pressure, was money funneling back into her pocket. She wasn't just trying to destroy my bridge, she was trying to profit from it. By Monday morning, I had proof. Her company had filed an $80,000 bid with the HOA to replace the damaged bridge with a concrete model that met community safety standards. It was a perfect scam. Destroy my structure with her own trucks, declare it unsafe, and then get paid to rebuild it. But her greed had blinded her to one crucial thing. I documented everything. Photographs, sound recordings, structural readings, even tire imprints from those same cement monsters. 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers had taught me that accusations mean nothing without evidence. Documentation wins wars. That afternoon I met with Jim Patterson, my family lawyer and longtime friend. He'd known me since childhood, the kind of man who wore truth like armor. I spread my photos across his mahogany desk. Jim whistled low. "She's not just playing dirty, Marcus," he said. "She's committing fraud." He immediately filed for an emergency restraining order against further truck traffic, backed by my structural evidence and Deborah's own inspection dates. The judge granted it within 24 hours. For the first time in weeks, the ground stopped trembling. But Deborah wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat. She weaponized it. The next morning, my phone buzzed with neighborhood alerts. Her public post was spreading like wildfire. "Concerned residents, we must act. Mr. Thornfield's bridge poses a danger to our community. His refusal to cooperate with safety regulations puts lives at risk." Within hours, my neighbors, people who once shared Christmas dinners with us, began whispering. Children stopped waving. Cars passed slower. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't a veteran protecting family history anymore. I was the paranoid old man endangering the neighborhood. Then came the betrayal in a courtroom. Deborah had managed to get my restraining order overturned, conveniently by a judge she played golf with. His letter claimed the bridge was part of a common access route and thus subject to HOA oversight. It was pure nonsense. My bridge predated the subdivision by 6 decades. It wasn't a common area. It was private, sacred, and protected by family deeds older than any HOA covenant. But the law doesn't always bend toward justice when corruption holds the gavel. Within days, the trucks returned, louder, heavier, relentless. The sound of grinding engines became my alarm clock. The vibrations made coffee spill, books slide off shelves, and tempers flare. My wife, Linda, stopped sleeping through the night. Every thud from outside sent her heart racing. Neighbors began reporting me for public hazards. Anonymous letters arrived in my mailbox with words like, "Sell while you still can." I'd faced mortars, flash floods, and collapsing dams. But nothing prepared me for the slow suffocation of bureaucratic warfare. Then one night, around 2 a.m, insomnia gifted me an idea. I remembered a rule from my Army engineering days. Don't fight the enemy's strength, find their foundation, and pull it out from underneath. So I went looking for Deborah's foundation. The next morning I drove to the county records office where Mrs. Henderson, a kind clerk who'd known my grandfather, helped me dig through century-old archives. We unearthed a leather-bound survey book from 1923. The handwriting was elegant, formal, and almost sacred. And right there, buried in legal phrasing, was the line that changed everything. Perpetual rite of passage for family, and invited guests across the timber span structure existing over Willow Creek. My bridge wasn't just family property. It was legally untouchable. It existed under pre-HOA easement law, giving my family exclusive rights that could never be overridden by future zoning or covenants. My great-grandfather, the stubborn genius that he was, had unknowingly built a legal fortress that would outlast him by generations. I spent the next 2 days in the county law library verifying the implications. Every reference, every precedent confirmed the same truth. Deborah's entire case rested on sand. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my bridge. Their authority stopped where history began. I left the courthouse with a grin I hadn't worn in months. For the first time, I was no longer reacting. I was planning. On Saturday, I met with Elizabeth Morrison, a local historian specializing in early 20th century structures. She inspected the bridge like a museum curator admiring an artifact. Her excitement was contagious. "This joinery work is extraordinary," she said, running her fingers along the mortise and tenon joints. "Your great-grandfather was an artist. This structure qualifies for historical preservation under state law." The moment she said that, the game changed completely. Once filed, that status would wrap my bridge in layers of red tape no HOA could ever slice through. Demolition would require environmental assessments, historical reviews, and public hearings that could drag for years. Deborah had cornered herself without even realizing it. Sunday I called a meeting, not with Deborah but with the other 4 HOA board members, people who had grown visibly tired of her power games. We met at Jake Morrison's house, the smell of fresh apple pie softening the tension. I laid out my evidence, the 1923 survey, the preservation report, the structural assessments. The room fell silent. "She's been lying to all of you," I said quietly. "Her plan isn't about safety, it's about profit." By the end of that meeting, 3 of the 4 members had withdrawn their support from Deborah's campaign. They didn't want lawsuits, or headlines, or criminal exposure. But Deborah? She didn't back down. Instead, she called an emergency community meeting the following week, her last desperate attempt to control the narrative. She packed the room with fearful residents, printed flyers with photos of collapsed bridges, and played the role of the savior, fighting a stubborn old man. I walked in quietly that night, blending into the crowd. Her voice filled the hall, smooth and commanding, promising safety and progress. But she didn't realize that every word she spoke was another nail in her own coffin. Because this time, I wasn't the target. I was the trap waiting to close. And when I took that microphone, I brought her empire crashing down. The HOA meeting looked more like a courtroom than a neighborhood gathering. Dozens of people sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering as Deborah Price stood at the podium in her pristine white suit, projecting confidence like a politician. "Mr. Thornfield's bridge is unsafe," she declared. "His refusal to comply endangers us all." The crowd nodded, some afraid, some misled. She had them wrapped around her finger, until I stood up. "Mind if I speak?" I asked, stepping forward with my laptop in hand. Deborah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Thornfield, this isn't—" "Exactly," I said, cutting her off. "This isn't what you think." I connected my laptop to the projector. The first image appeared, the 1923 property deed my great-grandfather filed. The ink was faded, but the words burned bright. "Perpetual right of passage across the existing timber-span structure over Willow Creek." Gasps filled the room. "This bridge existed 60 years before your HOA ever did," I said. "You have no authority over it." Deborah's composure cracked. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "Then maybe this isn't," I replied, switching slides. The screen filled with blueprints for luxury condos filed by Kensington Development Company, her company, months before she moved here. The lot numbers matched my land. Then came the bank loan documents listing my property as collateral. "You weren't protecting this community," I said evenly. "You were trying to steal it." The crowd turned. Murmurs rippled through the room. Even her allies looked stunned. Patricia Walsh, her vice president, demanded, "Deborah, did you disclose this when you ran for president?" Deborah stammered, speechless. Then Jake Morrison stood and called for a vote of no confidence. Within minutes, she was removed from office. But I knew Deborah wasn't finished. People like her don't accept defeat. They strike back harder. 3 days later, Mrs. Henderson from the county courthouse called. "Marcus," she said, breathless, "I found something incredible." She showed me a 1919 township map, and there it was. My family not only owned the bridge but the water rights to the entire creek. Every HOA project, every fee, every community improvement they'd claimed, all of it was built on my family's property. When my lawyer, Jim Patterson, saw the document, he smiled. "You don't just own the bridge, Marcus. You own the battlefield." That night, I found Deborah's last move waiting for me. Literally. My cameras caught floodlights and machinery by the creek at 4 a.m. She'd hired a demolition crew, waving forged county papers. "Tear it down," she ordered. By the time I arrived, the excavator had already struck the oak and sparked. Steel reinforcement. I'd planned for this. Seconds later, sirens blared. Sheriff's deputies and Channel 7 News pulled up together. Deborah froze, caught mid-lie, as the sheriff stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, "these permits are fake." The next morning, her arrest was headline news: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The empire she built on greed crumbled overnight. Months later, the Thornfield Bridge was declared a protected state landmark. Deborah lost everything: her career, her company, her freedom. And as I stand on the bridge at sunrise, coffee in hand, I trace the hand-carved rail my great-grandfather built and smile. Because in the end, she didn't just lose a fight. She lost to a bridge that refused to fall.